Hi, my name is Denise McKeithen, and this is a discussion of zero tolerance policies and whether they are effective or not. First, I'd like to explain what a zero tolerance policy is, and for purposes of this discussion and what I had in mind when I was studying zero tolerance policies. Zero tolerance policy is a severe enforcement of rules against unpleasant behavior such as violence, as well as possession of certain items such as drugs and weapons. So, for example, the school that I attended during high school had a zero tolerance policy against fighting. So if you got into a fight, it doesn't matter who started it, both of you are fighting, and both of you would be sent to an alternative school because of the zero tolerance policy that was in place. For purposes of this discussion, zero tolerance policies apply to public grade schools, grade school meaning a school from kindergarten to 12th grade that receives federal funding in the United States. The requirement for public schools to implement zero tolerance policy comes from the Guns Free School Act of 1994, which was originally implemented to keep guns out of schools, hence the name, but today it also applies to a threat or an incident of a student giving another student an aspirin. From the Guns Free School Act of 1994, if you violated zero tolerance policy against weapons, you're supposed to get suspended for a year, but now that zero tolerance policies apply to so much more than weapons, that 1 year expulsion applies to those incidents as well. If a school does not comply with implementing a zero tolerance policies, they risk not receiving federal funding. So the question that you may be having is, why is studying zero tolerance policies important? I mean, a policy that protects students from weapons and drugs sounds perfect, right? Well, students are at an age where they are susceptible to their environment, so a negative environment could lead to negative effects on the students that attend schools with zero tolerance policies. And the negative effects that I'm mostly concerned with in my research are stigmatization, discrimination, and the school to prison pipeline. Zero tolerance policies can apply to so easily to any student. Where do you draw the line between a student that gave another student an aspirin and a student that is habitually disruptive? There is no line when it comes to zero tolerance policies, so a student that isn't really a troublemaker is lumped together with a student that is habitually a troublemaker, which is stigmatization. Keeping the negative effects in mind, which are discrimination, stigmatization, and the school to prison pipeline in mind, prior research actually exists that shows that these negative effects actually exist due to zero tolerance policies and that they actually go hand in hand. A study conducted by Rocio presented that zero tolerance policies were forcing adolescents into the prison system due to mandatory punishment, causing youth to be viewed differently once they're forced to face the mandatory consequences of zero tolerance policies. And what are the mandatory consequences of zero tolerance policies? That is suspension. And a study done on suspension by the American Psychological Association explains that being suspended or expelled leads to a higher probability that students will either drop out of school or not graduate on time, which is the school to prison pipeline, which comes from the stigmatization. And Heitzig explains that most impacted by zero tolerance policies are students that are disabled, poor, and minority, which is discrimination. The research that shows that zero tolerance policies are discriminatory, stigmatizing, and lead to the school to prison pipeline, the American Psychological Association dedicated a task force in 2008 to study the effectiveness of zero tolerance policies in general, not just to schools, but they studied zero tolerance policies and they concluded that very little evidence shows that zero tolerance policies are effective, nor that zero tolerance policies are succeeding at what they are meant to succeed. Research that exists and shows the negative effects that can happen to students that attend schools with zero tolerance policies sparked my interest in studying whether or not zero tolerance policies are effective. So I came up with 5 hypotheses. Hypothesis 1 stated if individuals attended a grade school with a zero tolerance policy in place, then he or she will have been arrested at some point in his or her life. To measure the presence of zero tolerance policies, participants were asked, zero tolerance policies are severe enforcement of rules against unpleasant behaviors such as violence, as well as possession of certain items such as drugs and weapons. And then they're asked, did the school you attended throughout school have a zero tolerance policy in place? And they're given the options to answer yes or no. Then to measure arrest, participants were asked whether they have been found guilty of committing a misdemeanor or a felony, as well as if they have ever been to prison, which those are 3 separate questions, and they were given the options to answer yes or no. And hypothesis 2 states if individuals violated a zero tolerance policy while attending grade school, then he or she will have been labeled a troublemaker. The same measurement for the presence of zero tolerance policy applies to hypothesis 2 as hypothesis 1. And to measure being labeled a troublemaker, participants were asked, if you have ever violated a zero tolerance policy, do you feel it caused you to be labeled a troublemaker? Hypothesis 3 states that if individuals violated a zero tolerance policy while attending grade school, his or her performance will have been affected. The same measurement for presence of zero tolerance policies applies to hypothesis 3 again. And to measure school performance, if it was affected, participants are asked, if you were suspended for violating a zero tolerance policy, do you feel a suspension caused you to fall behind in school? With the close-ended answers yes or no, or I have not violated a zero tolerance policy. Hypothesis 4 states that if individuals aged 25 and older graduated school prior to 1994, he or she will have viewed zero tolerance policies as a positive implementation into school. To measure the year that participants graduated, participants were asked, did you graduate high school before 1994? With the answers of yes, no, or I did not graduate high school. To measure the age, they were asked which category best represents your age, with the answers 24 and younger or 25 and older. And to measure the positive stance on zero tolerance policies, participants were asked, to what extent do you agree with the statement zero tolerance policies need to be reformed, as well as to what extent do you agree with the statement zero tolerance policies need to be replaced with better policies? And they had Likert style responses of strongly agree, neither agree nor disagree, or strongly. Hypothesis 5 states if individuals that identify as a minority attended a school with a zero tolerance policy, then he or she will have been more likely to have been suspended for violating a zero tolerance policy than a non-minority. To measure minority status, participants were first asked which category best describes your race, and depending on what the participants responded to that question, I took their answer to the category of race question and compared it to what the Census Bureau considers minority and determined whether participants were categorized as a minority or not by his or her chosen race. Then to measure suspension, participants were asked, have you been suspended for violating a zero tolerance policy, with the close-ended answers yes or no, or I have not violated a zero tolerance policy. Who answered these questions and where did they come from? I got a convenient sample from the social media site Facebook. I posted a link to the self-report survey on Facebook for 1 week. I did not offer any incentive to complete the survey. I just left it up for a week on Facebook. I have 847 total Facebook friends, and by the end of the week, 41 participants had completed the self-report survey. To analyze the data that I collected from the self-report surveys, I conducted frequency and descriptive statistics on 10 of the control variables and 10 of the dependent variables that I used to create the questions in the self-report survey. And then I conducted 5 bivariate analyses, which showed the relationship between 5 of the control variables and 5 of the dependent variables. For purposes of this discussion, I will only focus on the statistics that either show that the hypotheses are valid or invalid. Hypothesis 4, 78.5% of the participants were 25 and older. However, only 22% graduated prior to 1994. So that shows that a small amount of the participants, 25 and older, attended school before the implementation of zero tolerance policies. Also, the results showed that only 10% of the participants reported that they disagree that zero tolerance policies need to be replaced. So hypothesis 4 was also shown to be invalid. Then with hypothesis 5, only 4% of the participants were minorities, so I didn't feel that a large enough of participants represented the minority category. So I felt that not enough evidence existed to prove hypothesis 5 either valid nor invalid. While yes, most of my hypotheses were shown to be invalid, I still believe that zero tolerance policies were ineffective, or at least that they needed to be replaced with a better policy. And I felt this way due to the last 2 questions on the survey, which were, to what extent do you agree with the statement zero tolerance policies need to be reformed? And to what extent do you agree with the statement zero tolerance policies need to be replaced with better policies? The results to these 2 questions showed that 75% of the participants agreed to some extent that zero tolerance policies need to be reformed, and 66% agreed to some extent that zero tolerance policies need to be replaced. So to me, this showed that a lot of the participants found zero tolerance policies to be ineffective, because why would so many of the participants feel that they needed to be replaced or at least reformed? What do we do with the prior research that shows that zero tolerance policies are ineffective, and that being in an environment that discriminates, stigmatizes, and leads to the school to prison pipeline can negatively affect students? And the research that I collected that shows that participants feel that zero tolerance policies should be replaced or at least reformed. Well, we take that information, we learn from it, and we use it to improve. And in order to improve, I came up with a policy that I feel would be a more useful implementation than zero tolerance policy. That I recommend implementing to replace zero tolerance policies is a policy that takes a broken windows approach, meaning implementing a policy that focuses on diminishing the smaller problems that often get ignored but inevitably lead up to catastrophic events such as school shootings. And I feel that a policy that focuses on smaller problems before they lead to bigger problems is important, because a study conducted by Skiba and Peterson reported that in several multiple victim shooting cases, The shooter had left numerous warning signs and cries for help, all of which went unnoticed or ignored. So smaller problems get ignored, and then catastrophic events like a school shooting event occur, and then everybody's supportive of zero tolerance policies. But once the fear and everything dies down from these catastrophic events, then people aren't so supportive of policies like zero tolerance policies. So I feel like a policy that focuses on the smaller problems before they become bigger is a more permanent policy than zero tolerance policies, which is basically a quick fix. Or I recommend schools implement a policy that requires teachers to learn classroom management skills, which are skills that help them resolve conflict and recognize alarming behavior in students. And when alarming behavior is recognized in students, then the teachers will direct students to student support teams. And the Department of Education explains that student support team is a team of staff members, parents, and personnel from related sources that dedicate their time to assist students with behavioral problems and guide those students towards the right resources that will help them find the source of what is causing the behavioral problems and work to fix or weaken the source of the problem. In conclusion, I feel that my policy recommendation is a more useful policy than zero tolerance policies, not only because it will eliminate the smaller problems before they become bigger problems, but also because it will eliminate the discrimination, the stigmatization, and the school to prison pipeline that comes along with zero tolerance policies. Students will no longer be labeled a troublemaker because they will be taught skills to help improve their behavior instead of simply suspended. And then if suspension is eliminated, then the school to prison pipeline is eliminated. And I feel that teaching students skills that will improve their behavior that they can use throughout their whole life is a more permanent solution than simply suspending students as with zero tolerance policies.